worse or better? That's the question that was framed at the beginning of the programme. The answer Rosie and myself gave was, it's better now.
Well,
that was
it's
the question
great
that was raised and the invitation to discuss.
The intensity of it, you don't have it.
Yeah.
You don't know it.
Of course not,
so
I'm not
keep
black.
quiet
No.
while I speak. You
Just let him
can't
speak.
say if there's no racism. I can say that.
I didn't say there was.
No, I
I
don't-
can
no.
say that.
At what point
Or
did
the
I say
extent to
there was
which
no
it
racism?
has spread and poisoned the body politic in this country.
But why is that? Why do you think that is? That racism, as far as you're concerned, has got worse rather than better?
I was born and met it. And it's worse than when I was 6 months old.
But why?
I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist. It has always been keeping us in a slave position to get the greatest productivity out of us. And
Do you think racism is worse now in this country than 50 years ago when you came from Trinidad and
I
Tobago?
wasn't here 50 years.
55
I
years
was
ago.
in the West Indies.
When you came, when it,
Hold on. I was not in apartheid in South Africa. I was in the West Indies as a colonial person. And that will teach you a lesson of how dangerous white power is. That will teach you about the oppression and exploitation of slaves and post-colonial people. You know nothing about it.
how dare you? How dare you?
What do you know that I
How dare you
know?
paint me like that? You know nothing.
You
If I
know
said that
nothing
about
about
you,
it.
you would be screaming racism. I actually believe that this week we should have been talking about reparations for slavery. We should have been giving an apology. That's actually what I believe. The question I asked you, and the question this programme is about, Darcus, is it worse now than it was before? I say no.
And
What do
he
you
says,
say?
and he says yes. We've heard very
Well,
clearly
tell me
what
how then.
Darcus
How's
says.
it worse?
Do you know
Educate me.
You know about the district club?
I understand what you're saying about that club. I completely abhor
Okay,
that. That's
but-
What
wrong.
have you done about
I
it?
used to.
Darcus,
I
hang on a
like
sec, because I want to ask John a question. Have you ever experienced the same sort of discrimination that Darcus is talking about? He's saying, I can speak from a position of a victim of racism, and I know what it's like.
And more than that,
Hang on,
when I spoke
all
up,
right, let him talk.
for 10 years, I was never not
I
hungry.
understand.
Let John
And I had
answer
little
that.
children of
I
mine
understand
suffering
that. I'm
and wondering is my father going to spend his last years in jail for standing up to talk against people like yourself.
John,
You're trying to paint
can
me
you,
as a racist.
John,
No, I'm not.
hang on a sec.
You can't speak
Slur.
for me.
Wait,
I
we
don't
are not.
want to speak for you.
We are
just
going-
like you can't speak for me.
Okay.
I'm not.
And I don't.
John,
understand.
I asked
haven't
you a
faced
question.
it. No, I
No,
accept that.
just stop a second while we calm this down a little bit, because otherwise we're going to get nowhere with
Yeah,
this.
sure.
The central allegation from Darcus was
Yeah.
that you don't know what it's like to be discriminated against,
I've clearly,
whereas he does.
clearly not because of the colour of my skin. That is correct. That doesn't mean my opinion is not valid. I've actually run nightclubs and I know what the problem with running doors. I never had a race. My club was in a multi-racial area. We didn't have those policies. I know those policies exist and I think they're disgusting and they should be stopped and we should use the law. But the idea that racism is worse in this country now than before is completely false. And the idea as a white bloke that I haven't got a right to express an opinion, I'm afraid, is the prejudice of the worst form. And you should be ashamed of
It's
yourself.
just as prejudicial.
I'm
Hang
ashamed
on,
of you, my
Darcus, I want to hear from the other panellists, otherwise it's just not fair.
I think it's
Miriam, can you address John's point, which is it is equally as discriminatory to say, if I am discussing racism, that makes me a racist or makes me a bigot just because I have an alternative point of view. Can you understand that? And can you understand how that stifles debate rather than encourages it?
I mean, there's a very interesting study by an American academic called D'Angelo that talks about what's called white fragility, which is when white people talk about race, they consider it to be an attack on them personally, when actually I think we need to move out of this idea, again, that it's a very personal prejudice to talk about structures. I want to come back to the working class argument, because I think it's really sad to see working class communities, of whether they're white or ethnic minority, sort of pitted against one another. The statistics show that 40% of Bangladeshi and Pakistani ethnically speaking children in this country live in poverty. That's compared to 15% of white working class children. That suggests to me that there are structural reasons why we might consider Britain to be racist.
Well, it's a chicken and egg thing, isn't it? Does the poverty come first, or is it about race and culture first?
Well, the point is that who's poor in this country is determined by historical reasons. Britain's imperial and colonial past is very much linked to who ends up living in ghettoised, marginalised
It's also
communities. And
determined
you
by
can't
educational
disassociate,
opportunity.
Rosie.
but you can't disassociate the
Let Rosie
attitudes
answer
of
that.
colonialism to.
I don't think it's only about colonialism. I think it is about educational opportunities, and I think we have a completely bisected education system in this country. And until that is solved, the greater picture is not going to be solved. I think that if one looks at London as a great global capital, compares it to other capitals, there is a certain amount of ghettoisation in other capital cities that I do not think you find in London. I honestly think that London is a great example of harmonious cultural living.
Despite race hate crimes going up by 27% in the
Right.
past year.
Well, possibly. I mean, I'm just speaking anecdotally. My children are all at state schools in London. They have friends, from all colours and creeds. And frankly, I'm not wandering around saying, "Oh, it's all marvellous." But I think, like John has said, I just don't think it's. I think it's got better.
Well, the greatest respect, Rosie, you'll know this because the work you're doing in Hull at the moment, which is where all my relatives came from. I lived there for 2 years after I've been in a children's home, so I know what it's like. It's different as you go out of London. London is very different to the rest of it. It's almost a country in itself to the rest of the country. There are ghetto areas in places like Birmingham and in places like Coventry, where I come from. We do need to address this. We do need to address poverty. It is linked to a large extent to
All right.
colonialism. I can accept that argument.
You realise that white people are the ethnic group least likely to marry outside of their ethnic group. It is white people that are least likely. They're also the least likely to want to live in diverse areas. So this idea that, actually it's got minorities.
Isn't that because there's more of them?
Well, no, of course not. We're talking proportionally.
Okay, all right. Let's hear from what you've been saying at home. You've been sending us lots of texts and tweets, inevitably, on this, Tommy.